Now live.
Good morning. This is the meeting of the Blue Ribbon Commission for the future of the California Bar. I would request Ms. Wong to call the roll, please.
Sure, Justice. Susan Bakshian,
Present.
Jackie Gardina, Dr. James Henderson,
Present.
Esther Lynn,
Present.
Judge Glenn Reiser,
Morning.
Judge Christine Rossi,
Good morning.
Mylene Spencer, Amy Williams,
Present.
and I see Jackie Gardina.
Present.
We have a quorum, Justice.
Thank you very much. Again, welcome everybody. I'm Justice Guerrero. On behalf of myself and the co-chair Josh Petula, I would like to welcome all members of the public as well to the fourth meeting now of the Blue Ribbon Commission for the future of the California Bar. By now you're all familiar, but for anyone listening in, I'll go ahead and repeat the mission and the goals of our commission. The Blue Ribbon Commission is charged with developing recommendations concerning whether and what changes to make to the California bar exam, and also whether to adopt alternative or additional testing or tools in order to ensure minimum competence to practice law. Today, I wanted to clarify that we are divided into subgroups for the morning and also for one in the afternoon. One subgroup is focused on discussing a pathway to licensure through an exam, and that subgroup will meet in the afternoon. The other this morning is focused on discussing a pathway based on a non-examination alternative. The morning session will run from 10 to 12:30, and the afternoon session will run from 1:30 to 4 o'clock. We also will hear any public comments, and we have received a couple in advance, actually 3, but 2 from one individual. So I'll go over some of the ground rules for the public comment period. We have, as noted in the agenda for today's meeting, public comments, which will be limited, and members of the public who wish to comment were encouraged to submit written comments prior to today's meeting in order to ensure that the commission would have sufficient time to consider those comments. The commission, as I indicated, has received all the written public comments and would like to thank members of the public for submitting those to us in advance. I will ask the commission coordinator to call any members of the public in the order in which they appear, and the comments should be limited to 2 minutes and not repeat any prior comments for any prior speakers. In terms of the logistics, for anyone participating by Zoom, you have the function to raise your hand virtually. It's a hand icon that appears on the bottom. It should be on the bottom center of your screen. So please click on that if you wish to make a comment. And for anybody participating by phone, you can virtually raise your hand. And in order to do that, you press star and the number 9, star key and the number 9. And the coordinator will call members of the public in the order in which they identify their raised hands. So I'll ask Ms. Wong again to see if there are any members of the public who wish to submit an oral comment at this time.
At this time, Justice, I don't see any raised hand from the public.
Okay, thank you. And as indicated, we have received written comments, and those are submitted to the commission as well. As I indicated for today, we have divided into 2 subgroups, and we also will have a presenter. And Donna and Amy have prepared written material sort of to orient what and identify areas where we are going to discuss the various pathways and identify what additional information we need in order to move forward and identify recommendations for each of the pathways before reconvening together in one group. So I don't know, Donna, if you want at this point to sort of go over the game plan for today and just provide an overview of the topics that we'll be discussing. And then we'll hear from a couple of presenters for each session. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So today may be today's probably going to be a relatively short meeting. I think that one of the things that we wanted to do was to make sure to orient the subcommittees on the types of considerations that we've identified after going through the mission statement that we all sort of developed, looking at the considerations from the prior meeting that we went through, the additional research topics that we had talked about at the first meeting. We put together this series of guiding questions that we think the committee will want to explore. And so I'd like to go through some of these, and then to the extent that there are additional ones, then we will add those as well. And then after we hear today from the Legal Services Funders Network, we will talk about next steps. And when we get to next steps, I'm just going to sort of advance my slide very quickly just to show you sort of what we'll be doing is sort of revisiting these questions that we're going through, that we'd be going through now to talk about. So if this is what we're going to be thinking about, if this is what we need to identify, for example, if one of the things that we need to figure out are what are the knowledge, skills, and abilities that need to be demonstrated, and how do we do that through a non-exam alternative, then we want to go through, well, how do we find that out? What are the research questions? So we'll be getting to that at the end of the meeting. And I just wanted to lay that out just so we don't get caught up in that while we're going through these guiding questions. Again, these were put together by looking at the mission statement that we adopted in terms of what are the guiding principles that are of concern to the committee. We need to make sure that we keep in mind. And the topics that were talked about at the last meeting when folks were expressing sort of their initial instincts based on what we'd heard so far, and looking at the considerations that we developed before. So what we've put on the page here for this subcommittee that is exploring a pathway to licensure through a non-exam alternative is minimum competence. What does minimum competence look like when what does determining minimum competence look like in a non-exam world? How do you determine that somebody possesses the requisite knowledge, skills, and ability when you're not testing them in a sort of single sit-down licensure exam? And how does that work across school types? And how does that work with the law office study program, right? We certainly need to recognize that in California, we've got ABA approved law schools, California accredited law schools, and registered or unaccredited law schools. In addition, we have our law office study program, which is a program without law school participation, without attending law school, but there are education requirements built in there. If we want to develop this pathway, is it a pathway that can be developed across all school types? And how do we do that? How do we ensure the consistency and the quality to make sure that regardless of which school type or law office study program you participated in, we can ensure that level of minimum competence. And we're looking at fairness and equity and access issues. In the non-exam world, those include things such as affordability of any program that we would require, and would, for example, that mean that after law school you would need to work for a year for under supervision, and if that's something that's going to be paid at a lesser rate, or not paid at all, is that something that would be accessible to all applicants, all law students, because of, you know, they can't jump into the market and get the full-time salary that they would need. Also talking about meaningful access to quality supervisors or other experiential learning. This goes to, among other things, issues of race, ethnicity, and gender. It goes to issues of school type. And if people are going to be required to go out into the world to get supervisors, are there going to be supervisors that are available to all? Are we going to end up in a world where the white male students from the ABA approved law schools are the ones who get the supervisors, and other people are struggling to find supervisors and can't complete this alternative? How do we ensure that there's meaningful access for everybody who we admit into a non-exam alternative pathway to get the supervisors or experiential learning that would be part of this proposal? Scalability. I think we were all intrigued by some of the things we heard from New Hampshire, some of the things that we heard from Oregon, but they're talking about a very different size pool. And when we've got 50 plus law schools in California, we are talking about, you know, thousands and thousands of people who would normally be taking a bar exam every year. How does that translate into a scalable program at, you know, 50 plus law schools, supervisors for everyone? And does it mean we can't fully scale it, right? And this is certainly an option for the committee to, this subcommittee to consider, is this can't be fully scaled, and so we should limit it to only some of the candidates who are seeking licensure. You know, is it a number per law school? Is it a type of law school? Is it, you know, what would be the requirements if we can't sort of fully scale this? Other guiding questions that we constructed that we think the committee would need, this subcommittee would need to make sure that they're thinking about as we are pulling together our recommendations, is how do our recommendations protect the public? How do our recommendations ensure minimum competence in professional ethics and professional ethics and responsibility? That was a separate guiding principle that we had in our mission, separate from minimum competence in the substantive areas. One of the big issues that we've heard people talking about, heard committee members talking about, is reciprocity or portability. How does this pathway give, you know, how does it address issues of reciprocity and portability in terms of California educated law students who want to take their licensure to another state, as well as law students educated in another state that want to get licensed in California, or attorneys licensed in another state or another country that want to bring their license to California and be able to practice, right? We've heard about reciprocity issues really from all of those angles. And that's not to say that we need to create something that addresses all of those angles, but we need to think about all of those angles when we're putting together our recommendations and understanding if we think something is a limitation, is that an acceptable limitation or not, and just sort of think through what the implications are. And finally, and this is, the questions that I'm asking on this slide are actually the same. I'm asking these same questions to the exam pathway group. The questions on the first slide were more unique for each. But the last one is, are the recommendations of this subcommittee mutually exclusive of the other pathway? So that's to say, whether, you know, do we want to think like Oregon, which has sort of 3 options, right? A bar exam, and they're 2 different alternative pathways. And you could go any one of those routes. Do we want to pair a non-exam alternative with some sort of exam that's not a full bar exam, but is some subject matter test, some knowledge or skill test, so something else, and if we do want to pair it with sort of create this as one of several options, one option being a bar exam, then ultimately we'll be getting the recommendation from the exam subcommittee on whether what we pair it with should be a UBE or a California-based exam. This group may have some thoughts in terms of, if the challenge, if we come up with a pathway and say, one of the negatives is reciprocity for California educated law students who want to take their degree elsewhere, then maybe we'd recommend that a test would be a UBE, for example, so that could be part of it. So those people who want to go elsewhere can have that exam a possibility. And so that would just be sort of part of the, are our recommendations mutually exclusive? And so that's what we've identified. This is staff and Justice Guerrero and Josh have put together as the thoughts on what the guiding questions are for the subcommittee. And before I take down my screen, I want to see if there are questions about any of those, and probably more importantly, additional suggestions for what we need to make sure that we are considering as we're going through this work and bringing presenters and research to us and evaluating our next steps.
Just a quick question.
Yes.
When you're talking about, Donnie, you brought up kind of how do we know whether or not the alternative pathway program is establishing minimum competence. And I don't know whether Dr. Henderson can speak to this, but obviously law schools are now required to engage in some assessment and learning outcomes that are distinct from a grade in a class. And I'm wondering if there is a professional assessment in other areas or other professions in which minimum competence or whatever the level of standard is in that profession has been determined in this kind of program.
So that is absolutely the kind of question that we would want to research. 100%, right? There may be a real easy way to do that. Dr. Henderson, I don't know if you've got an answer off the top of your head to that question about whether there are parallels in other disciplines for establishing minimum competence through learning outcomes.
There absolutely are parallels, and as I understand what Jackie was asking about, we're in, say, medicine. Instead of the licensure examinations administered by states, including a performance test that has examinees implementing procedures on patients, they have internships where there are standardized measures that are used to evaluate their interaction with patients and the treatment that they provide to patients. That's duplicated in even a more serious way in the residency programs that physicians specialists complete. Those are standardized curriculums, and they all include assessments of skills along the way. That allows the specialty board of certification in medicine simply to use a multiple choice test with an oral. They do normally also include an oral for the physician certification. So that's one parallel that I believe, if I understood your question correctly, it answers it.
Yeah, so it would be, in this direction, we would need to develop a standardized way to assess for supervisors to assess whatever the skill or ability, et cetera, that we're attempting to establish minimum competence for. A standardized measure. I shouldn't have used the word test, measure.
Well, tests are measures, and I think that certainly it would be important to list what should be measured, and perhaps to offer suggestions about how that measurement might take place, but leave some choice to the schools who are in the position of having to defend the procedures that they do use.
Great, thank you. Amy?
I can't help but think, years ago when I was in England, the high school levels that they have there, you take your levels in a certain area and you pass that area. And my question is, firstly, is it our intention that the pathway to licensure through a non-exam is intended to grant carte blanche the ability to practice law in any given law area? Or are we contemplating 12 different areas of licensure, and that individual may only practice within that specific area of law? This is Amy, and I'm done speaking.
Thanks, Amy. That's a really interesting question. I certainly am not going to give a definitive answer on that, but that would, what I would say is that would be a very different way for us to admit people to the practice of law. Right now, they are admitted, once you're determined to possess the minimum competence, you are admitted to practice whatever law you are going to practice. And then by the rules of professional conduct, right, you've got to ensure that you've got the competence in the particular area. It would certainly add quite a level of complexity, I think, if we are admitting people to practice in each of the subject areas that we, in order to practice an admiralty law, sort of create more like the legal specialists exams, legal specialist sort of certifications. It would be a very different way to admit people to the practice of law than we've ever done in the past. Certainly not something that had crossed my mind, but that may simply be that may be due to the limitations of my creativity.
Well, the reason I bring it up is because in order to designate yourself as a specialist in a given area of law, you have to take an extra exams, an extra certification process in order to be designated a specialist in that area of law. So if that is something that we require, it kind of blows my mind that we're allowing attorneys, even now with the exam licensing process, that we are giving individuals who do not have, and I'm not talking about reciprocity, I'm talking about those that are just taking the bar exam for the first time, have never practiced law. We're giving them carte blanche to do whatever they want in terms of law. There's no competency there. I honestly think that just because you pass law school and maybe you pass the bar exam does not mean that you're a competent lawyer. So why wouldn't we then put those same safety, protecting the public safety measures on first-year attorneys the way we do to specialists? It's just my thought. And I don't think that we should, I think we should think about that over the next few months.
And I think one of the things that the exam pathway working group needs to think about is, if the conclusion is that the law school experience and passage of the bar exam does not make you minimally competent to practice law in California, then that's a fault of those processes, right? And so if we are going to use a licensure exam, then that subcommittee needs to be asking these same questions. What does an exam need to look like in order to give us that confidence that somebody in fact does possess the minimum competence that is needed for entry-level attorneys? Yeah, sort of an interesting perspective to bring to this discussion. Kristen. You're on mute, Kristen?
Now I'm good, right? Okay. You know, my comments have, I think, more to do with the fairness and access issues, and you know, and Justice Guerrero know that sort of this is where I'm approaching this issue from. So for me, I think one of the things that I think we need to be looking at is what the outcomes in New Hampshire and Oregon have been for underrepresented students in the law schools when we're talking about an alternate licensure pathway. You know, are they having a harder time getting supervisors? And that even goes, I think, for me to, if we're going to use a hybrid model, that, like the last question you asked, is this the only way? And if it's a hybrid method, then my same concerns would be, I think, well, my concerns would be the same post licensure. Are students who took the exam having better outcomes get in the job market than, say, folks who use the alternate pathway? Because, you know, my fear is that is setting up a two-tiered system that isn't equitable, and that, you know, what you may end up having is, you know, for example, folks who go to ABA, non-ABA accredited law schools, if those folks are using an alternate pathway, is that making it harder for them on the other side to get employed? Because, you know, realistically, attorneys right now in California all took the bar exam. And so all of us are, you know, sort of predisposed to this idea that taking this bar exam was part of a rite of passage. And so I don't want us to set up another inequitable system. And so I guess I'd want to know from those other states that have had it, what those outcomes look like, both within the law school model of getting supervisors and then post licensure job outcomes.
Yeah, and you'll see when we turn to the slide at the end that looking at outcomes in other places is absolutely part of what we need to do. The difficulty is like Oregon's is still conceptual, right? Hasn't even been implemented yet, so we've got no outcomes. So we will, you know, have to see where we can reach to in order to get any of that information. And I don't, you know, and the New Hampshire program is very small, right? I think they said, you know, what, 25 per year or something like that. So so it may be difficult to find that information, and so that's absolutely a consideration that we need to continue to think through. But we may not have have all of the data we would like to support that. There was another hand up. Was it Judge Reeser?
Yeah, this is so, you know, I missed the last meeting, unfortunately. So I've been in this world of lawyers for a long, long time. And I've encountered and still encounter, you know, over the course of, you know, many, many decades, you know, tens of thousands of lawyers. And the farther I get away from the bar exam, which I took in the 70s, the less criticality it seems to me in terms of competence the bar exam has, right? So listening to this, I'm hugely encouraged about this discussion. I mean, the way it lays out in California now, once you pass the bar, I should say, once you're licensed, you're essentially, and this goes back to what Dr. Henderson was analogizing to earlier, you're essentially a GP, right? You're a general practitioner. And so if you need knee surgery, you probably wouldn't necessarily knock on the door of a GP. You may want a referral to an orthopedic surgeon, right? And so California lawyers to some degree, and the state bar to some degree, have recognized that and have created this legal specialization program, which may need to be, you know, further developed and augmented so that not everybody is just a GP, and there's more recognition of specialties, because that's been the state of the art over the last, you know, 150 years, but as it's evolved. So I'm encouraged by this discussion, But I do think, and I agree with Kristen, that the diversity inclusion piece is hypercritical. And so if, as we consider other pathways, we have to be mindful of that and think outside the box. Maybe there needs to be some kind of default allowance for people to have other choices other than, white males growing up in a privileged household, being able to sit for 3 months to study for a single exam, premised on memorization. We've all had that experience, right? Where you've seen a lawyer's work product and you ask yourself, the first question is, how do they pass the bar? Right? And the inquiry should really not be what's wrong with this person. The inquiry really should be, are we testing for the right things? Or should we be testing at all, right? And so, what form does that test take? So I think this is a really important group, and I think we're on an important mission, but I think we ought to really keep our minds open to some of these problem areas and really think about, not necessarily blowing things out, but expanding things to the point that everyone has an equal opportunity in California.
And to be clear, we're not opposed to blowing things up.
Well, I don't want to scare people, right? I mean, maybe that's the other group. That's why they joined the other group. But you have to, because part of this piece ultimately is going to be messaging, right? And there's going to be huge amounts of pushback from the bar for all of the reasons that the Oregon folks articulated at the last meeting, right? I mean, they understated it, but there's going to be editorial pieces. There's going to be consumer issues. There is the huge issue of oversight and verification, right? But we can deal with those, but and we have to be very cautious in doing so.
Yep, absolutely.
I'm sorry.
I don't see any additional hands raised. Justice Guerrero, if you want to turn it back to you to take us through our next steps.
Okay, thanks.
Part of our meeting.
Thank you so much for that overview and for your initial comments. I don't know, I can't see if we have Ms. Solot on here, do we?
Yes, we do. And we will vote Ms. Solot to the panelists.
Okay, so thank you very much. I'm very happy to welcome Ms. Claire Solot to speak with us here today. She is one of the founders of the Legal Services Funders Network. And as you saw from the materials that were distributed in advance, they have developed really an amazing postgraduate bar fellowship program. And they did this during the midst of the pandemic in order to, I guess, a couple of things to ensure that the needs of the Bay Area legal services organizations were met and to serve their clients. And also, very importantly, to make sure that the May 2020 graduates of the Bay Area law schools who participated were to help them too, because they were faced with the delay in an ability to take the California bar exam. So I'm really happy to hear from her, as well as welcoming Jessica Juarez, who is a Golden Gate Law graduate of class of 2020. And I believe now that she's working, or has in the past at least worked, with the Homeless Action Center. So we're really happy to have both of you here and to hear from you.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. And terrific that you all are running our slide deck for us. As mentioned before, my name is Claire Solot, and I have the great pleasure of being one of the founders of the Legal Service Funder Network. For those of you who want more information about the LSFN, there is a link at the end of the slide deck, which will tell you how to find our website. And I'm happy to answer additional questions. But what I'm most excited about today is that I get to introduce you all to one of our 2020 fellows who's going to join me in presenting today. We have about a half-hour PowerPoint presentation and have allotted about 15 minutes for Q&A following. So with that said, if you can turn to the next slide, and Jessica is going to lead you through our plan for today.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for giving us your time and for allowing us to speak today. It means a lot to me and to Claire as well. What we're looking at right now, this is what we'll be covering today. We'll do a little bit of welcome and introductions. Then we'll do a little bit talk about the LSFN Fellowship, how it was created, the features and key demographics. We'll also talk about the impact it's had on, not only my life, but also all of the fellows that have had the opportunity to be part of this program. We'll discuss the foundation for a pathway to licensure, and we'll have some time for questions at the end.
So we're going to start off with the tale of two law students. As many of you who've met me before know, I love to borrow from other examples of things that I think are exemplary. And so this is a little bit of a riff on the tale of two taillights. And thankfully, Brendan Green and his crew that worked on that production gave me a little bit of the go ahead. So I am an example of what we consider a traditional law student. I went to USF immediately after graduating from undergrad. I was very fortunate in that I came from a family where we had the means so that I did not need to take out any educational loans, and English is my first language. When I got to law school, I already had predetermined in my head I was going to become a family law attorney, and continued on that path to the point where when I was looking for a job, ironically, there were not many options in the private market, and I actually ended up in the public sector, not by choice, but by circumstance. In terms of continuing my path, I decided that I would ultimately go into private practice. And at this point in time, I am an inactive licensee, but I am fortunate in that I get to still work within the legal aid sector and work on access to justice. In terms of my bar exam experience, I was extremely fortunate. I did not need to work while I was studying for the bar exam. I was married and I had a husband with an income, and in fact was able to stay at the hotel adjacent to where the bar exam was being given, so that I had those 3 days with rest and quiet and no other distractions. Jessica, tell us a little bit about your experience.
So I grew up in a neighborhood where it wasn't safe to walk around at night. My family was low income, and I got a free lunch at school every day. Spanish was my first language. I didn't learn English until, I believe, kindergarten, and that was a rough transition for me. My parents migrated from Latin American countries. They have an equivalent to high school diploma. I am a first generation student and professional, meaning I was the first one to go to university and graduate, first one to go to law school and graduate. And as far as my law school experience, I did intern both 2L and 3L year, but unfortunately those positions were not paid. I did try to get side jobs here and there when possible, such as like delivering law school magazines and things like that. But, obviously that didn't make up for, all of the living costs that come with going to law school. So I did have to take out a lot of student loans. And as a single parent of a now 11-year-old, I had to ask for more student loans to help pay for living costs for my family, but also to include other living costs, such as to pay for my daughter's after school program. My debt is almost $300,000. It's a little scary just to say it out loud. I always envisioned myself working within the community, which meant, public interest law for me. And just like any other 3L, I had the high stress of looking for a paid job after graduation. Fortunately, LSFN started this fellowship opportunity, and I found a nonprofit to work with, which was the Homeless Action Center. I did take the bar in October 2020 while working with the LSFN fellowship, but I did not pass, and that was my first time taking it. After completing my LSFN fellowship last year with HAC, I was fortunate that another LSO host wanted additional fellows, And so I was hired as a contract attorney at Legal Assistance to the Elderly via my PLL status. I am currently awaiting the results of the July 2021 exam. If I don't pass again, I will have to take additional time off to prepare for and take the February exam, which for those of us who have only taken the remote exam will be a very different experience from what we've been doing. So that's a little bit about me.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So on this slide, what you see is a summary of the current LSFN fellowship program. It's a lot of data to process. We will make sure that you have the slide deck available so you can look at it in more detail. But the basic components of our fellowship, and we'll go through that on the next slide in a little bit more detail, are tailored to be able to, as was introduced earlier, help meet the needs of LSOs in our community, help create an opportunity for new law graduates, and partner it right now in sync with having to take a July bar exam. But as we'll discuss later, if that was not part of the requirement, so many of these opportunities would actually be even better when it comes to the outcomes for both the host organizations and for our fellows. Next slide. So as I said before, we're going to walk you through some of the key components of why we think that our model works so well. So in terms of the application, Jessica is going to tell you a little bit about what her experience was.
So the application does screen to identify law school graduates with a passion for public interest work and skills. There is room for modifications as needed, and it did ask important questions such as, providing space to write why, we were interested in working in public interest work, describe the experiences that reflect that interest and things like that. So it can be tailored to, public interest work or whatever needs to be modified as needed.
And the question came up earlier in terms of whether, in fact, there is equitable access to these opportunities. I will tell you the hardest applicants I have to place are the traditional law students. The legal aids want folks like Jessica. They want people who have language skills. They want people who have real life skills. They love it when they have fellows who've actually used legal services or their family members have used legal services in the past. And so when it comes to sort of worrying about those traditional issues that were barriers to models of pupillage style supervised licensure, I think that we've really moved past that, particularly in the public interest and government sectors. The next piece that we think is really important is we have an MOU that both our fellows and our hosts sign, and that's laid out very succinctly in terms of expectations. I'm happy to say we've never had a problem with anyone not completing the requirements that are outlined in the MOU, but I do think it is an important piece in terms of maintaining continuity and public safety. Jessica, can you tell us a little bit about the supervision you had and the type of work assignments you had?
Yeah, and there's a later slide where I'll go more into detail about the supervision and meaningful work assignments. But basically, it's my belief that this mirrors the type of supervision that a first-year attorney would receive. And as far as my experience and other fellows' experiences, we got weekly check-ins, whether that was once a week or more as needed. We did get all of our work reviewed, whether it was a motion or a brief, and that obviously means that there's several drafts before getting the okay, and you're getting constant feedback after each one. Of course, this would have been better in person, but being in the middle of a pandemic, we adapted and we did it all through Zoom, through phone calls, whatever we could manage to do so that we could still advocate for our clients and do the best work that we could.
So another key component of our fellowship is that we have monthly learning sessions. We've put on this slide examples of some of the curriculum. One of the wonderful things about having these built-in learning sessions is they're also able to adapt and respond to community needs. So for example, this year we added a Housing 101 component because we know that all public interest attorneys at this point have some housing that's coming into their orbit in terms of client needs, regardless of the type of legal aid organization they're working at. Next year, we expect consumer debt will probably be something that we add a specific breakout for. And so this is responsive and adaptable, which we think is really important. But at the same time, we also have some fundamentals that are always going to be in the program. We kick off each season with Selena Copeland from LAC giving an overview of the legal aid process and sector throughout the state. Disaster legal aid, sadly, we think is always going to be required. And in addition to that, there would be flexibility in terms of the career development track if this was morphed into a program that was really working with people, not just as a temporary fellowship, but as a full first-year attorney process, adding more time to work on some of the essentials and some of the key curriculum that the State Bar might decide that it wants to add into the program. Another important piece of the program is our evaluation process. We have both a midterm evaluation and a final evaluation that both our fellows and our hosts complete. Now, you may be thinking at this point, this is really onerous. And one of the things that we pride ourselves on is the fact that the application is very, very brief. Jessica, how long do you think it took you to do the application?
Surprisingly, less than half an hour. I want to say like 15 minutes. I mean, this was 2 years ago. I barely remember what I did last week, but I do remember being able to access it on my tablet, being able to access it on my laptop, being able to access the application on my cell phone. And so it was very, adaptable. And I don't think it took me that long. I think the longest it took me was the part where I had to talk about myself and how, why, advocate for yourself, which is always the hardest part for me.
And similarly, the evaluations take usually between 20 to 30 minutes for each. The last little comment at the bottom goes to this issue about public safety, which is important to recognize that public interest attorneys, whether they're at LSOs or government offices, don't deal with client trust accounts, which tends to be the #1 discipline issue that you all have alerted me to. Next slide. So this is a slide that shows you the demographics of our 2020 fellows. We have, as you can see, a population, this cohort had 30 people in it, much more diverse than what one would anticipate. We did not ironically screen during that application process. This year, we actually did ask at the application stage for some demographic information. We're delighted to tell you that it's even more diverse than last year's class. And when we look at diversity, we're looking at both the traditional factors that people consider, but also things like, are you a parent? How do you identify? What educational background did your family have? And we're extraordinarily proud of the diversity that we have in our fellows. And as I mentioned earlier, our LSOs are so excited to work with this population because they mirror the client community. And that's one of the things that is so important in terms of creating a relationship, especially with a population that more often than not is a little tentative when it comes to working with an attorney. Next slide, please. So Jessica is going to talk a little bit more, as she mentioned, about her experience when it came to supervision, the assignments that she was able to do, and the type of work that she was doing.
So I know supervision, quality of assignments, and hands-on experiences are super important when considering a pathway to licensure. As far as supervision, like I said, I believe it does mirror what a first-year attorney does. We received one-on-one, if not small group trainings that were very engaging. We participated in, and we also, there was also one-on-one supervision, not just with one attorney, but with several managing attorneys. As far as check-ins, there was weekly check-ins. Sometimes when I had actually like written assignments, such as a brief, I would do more than one weekly check-in, as far as, as the schedule could provide. And so my work was reviewed all the time. I did several drafts with feedback. Supervisors were always checking in with me about my assignments as far as progress, helping me with time management and advising me on how to do that. how to log in hours and keep track of that, making sure that I didn't go over hours, and how to do comp time and things like that. So there was constant supervision and constant caring. Like the supervisors actually cared about our progress, cared about like how I was doing personally as well, because we were, working in the middle of a global pandemic. And so that was extra special for me. And I think that's why I always go for public interest opportunities, because there's that level sense of passion and dedication that, not necessarily other fields may or may not have. As far as quality of assignments, they were always checking in to see if the work was challenging, whether I had capacity to do more work or not. And it was okay to say, no, I'm okay right now. I have enough on my caseload, or you know what, I'd love to do a different assignment, such as a research project, or I'd love to sit in and watch a hearing. They were always up for, us trying to do different things and trying basically to expand our experience. And a lot of the fellows, if not all, were just as eager beavers as I was, where we wanted to do as much as we could and get as much experience as we could with this type of opportunity. Like I said earlier, we did motions, briefs, research projects, all kinds of assignments that I believe a first-year attorney does get as well. As far as hands-on experiences, a lot of the fellows, including myself, got to sit in and observe different hearings or trials. We participated in different meetings with stakeholders where there was a lot of collaboration. A lot of times we don't get to see that part because stakeholders is a whole different level. But the supervisors were super open to that, which I appreciated, just to see different levels of a nonprofit organization. One of the most important parts for me was working with clients. And the best part was working with clients that looked like me, because for them it was super important to see a brown woman whose first language was Spanish, who was low income at one point, and all of those things that they could identify with, they saw that in me. And so they felt even more comfortable me working with them in their case. So that meant a whole lot to me, seeing that they, believed in me, but also appreciated seeing people that looked like them. We did do a lot of our own hearings as well, or our own preparation for trials. So that gave us the opportunity to do direct examinations, cross-examinations, motions in limine, and more. And this, I believe, put us ahead of the game.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Next slide. So this slide pretty much speaks for itself in terms of the satisfaction that our fellows have had with the program, our hosts have had with the program, the law schools have had. And as mentioned earlier, the program was really designed in response to what was happening in 2020, both in terms of the pandemic and the delay in the bar exam. But the LSFN, because it was so successful, decided that we would continue to extend the program. And as a result, this year we have another cohort, as I mentioned, even more diverse than last year's cohort. We expanded into additional counties. We added 2 more law schools. And in fact, we're working with 6 cities throughout the United States right now who are interested in replicating this program because of its success. Next slide. So as Jessica mentioned before, the finances of being a public interest attorney are quite challenging. And she's going to walk you through not the entirety of this slide, but if you really focus down in the bottom sections that are highlighted in red and green, what happens in terms of the course of the 3L graduating and then finishing out that year when they're taking the bar exam.
Right. So I know there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of math and numbers, but we do want to focus on the bottom 2 rows where it talks about basically, those going into public interest law versus those working for private firms. Now, the public model does put us into more debt and the pressure that comes with that. That's why it's in red. It puts us at a disadvantage and we don't get to work until after, versus the private model is in green because they get extra support and extra advantages that they have. And we can invert that. If we are given a different path, we have the opportunity to start working now. We can work towards a license that we would have a surplus where the blue highlighted area is. We would have that part in green versus the red as a public interest attorney. And so we're not only learning hands-on, but we're giving parents like me, people in huge debt like me, low income folks like me a chance to survive and work with our community.
And one of the issues that was raised earlier about equity relates to this slide when it comes to the traditional bar exam model. One of the things that they have learned is that the additional stress, the financial stress that new law graduates face, both from the debt that they already have, but also the additional debt that they will incur while they're preparing for it and taking and awaiting the bar exam result, impacts their success rate on the exam itself. So we will never know, as long as this population continues to carry that burden, what it would have been like for them if they didn't have all these pressures. But if there was an alternative pathway to licensure, we actually would be able to level the playing field for the exam takers themselves. Next slide.
So this goes over, key components, increases public interest firms' capacity. New public interest attorneys would be able to commence their jobs immediately upon graduating from law schools rather than, waiting 6 months later after the bar results. And this gives, different offices the opportunity to offer 3Ls jobs during the academic year or through OCI without having to wait until the bar results are announced. And I personally had friends who wanted to do public interest work, but went for private firms instead because of the higher pay and because they could get hired on much earlier compared to the public interest organizations. I'm currently working with a nonprofit who is hiring, and we struggle because there's a delay in ability to hire people who are waiting results versus those who pass and go to private fields anyways. They don't have that challenge. So this is a challenge that the public sector is dealing with. Organizations are afraid of or are at risk, if we don't know if the person can really be put to work if they don't pass. Parents like myself, BIPOC, low income, we all have these uncertainty with the next steps. If public interest organizations could have opportunity to make offers when the private firms do, then that would balance things out and it would be incredibly meaningful. People like me would definitely jump at programs or opportunities like this. And like I said, public interest orgs are at a disadvantage because they don't have the ability to hire anyone. And I strongly believe that this would change the trajectory of someone's 3L year. As far as reduces barriers and financial impediments to pursuing public interest work, like I said, if we could start working June 1st, that's essentially half of my salary that I could start earning. And it can reduce, my student loan payments versus it continuing to increase, which is a huge burden and stress upon anybody, let alone, a parent or somebody who's low income. Improved readiness of new attorneys to practice law. We would be receiving the same type of training as supervision a first-year attorney would be getting. So this pathway isn't asking for anything extra. I know that this was a fear when, the PLL program was started, and it was also a fear for the extended PLL program for the 1390s. But the State Bar built that foundation already, and it can be modified on an ongoing basis if deemed necessary, and you would make sure that it helps ensure public safety. Increases attorney diversity. Like I said, this is another method, another path that would increase the numbers. For those, especially for those who don't test well, who don't have the educational support system, who aren't able to have that luxury of taking 3 months off to study with no pay, let alone, dealing with other life experiences or children or other, a lot of people were taking care of family members during the pandemic and, didn't have that opportunity to take the bar exam. And there was a lot of things going on that really kept people from getting that opportunity to get their license versus if we have this alternative pathway, they would still have that chance. And most importantly, it creates that opportunity for BIPOC non-traditional students.
Next slide. So we're going to finish up giving you what we perceive as the modifications to our program that would be required to turn it into a pathway licensure pilot. And when I say that, we really think it's important for this group to think about this as a pilot opportunity. With that in mind, I would recommend that it really be offered to a limited pool of 3Ls, and that would be folks that are interested in going into public service, whether it be at an LSO or in government. Not only by doing that does it ensure that it would be a limited population, but it's also a benefit back to the community, because we know, quite frankly, that there are more than enough folks that want to go into private practice in California, but where we're really struggling is to have people who are serving the public. So the application process, as we said before, we'd recommend keeping it relatively similar to what currently exists for the program. In terms of offering it to folks that did not attend California law schools, I think that there's been a lot said earlier in terms of basic competency. And one of the things that we feel exists currently is that the law schools are our partners. Not only do they help get out the information to the 3Ls to tell them about our program, but we're really trusting the law schools that they have a level of competency that they require to give someone a diploma. So that's really sort of the litmus test that we work with. We think that there could be some modifications when it comes to non-ABA schools. For example, the way our program currently runs, you can either apply in a joint application, which is what Jessica did. She had an LSO that she applied with, or you can apply as a solo where we try to match. And it might be, for example, a case where for a non-ABA graduate, maybe you only have them going down the joint path, which means that the LSO already has a relationship and they've vetted that individual and know that they feel comfortable working with that person. Duration, currently our program runs the 6 months from law school graduation until the announcement of the bar exam results. As mentioned earlier, it could be expanded to a year, which seems like a very reasonable time frame for people to be able to do supervision and then be ripe for recommendation for licensure. The compensation would parallel that. Right now, we set up our stipend to be equivalent to the average first-year salary. Geography, currently our program is in the 9 barrier counties and rural counties in both Central and Northern California. We know that this program can be expanded. The reason I know is because I constantly get emails and phone calls from folks in Southern California who are begging us to bring the program down there. And I've worked with LAC and other statewide organizations that say that they would be happy to become partners in terms of expansion. The learning sessions, as we mentioned earlier, they're wonderful because they're adaptable, and it would give the state bar the opportunity to add into the learning sessions key components that the state bar thinks are important. In addition, the first-year attorney requirements could be added. The evaluations, as we mentioned before, the midterm and final evaluations don't take a lot of time, but are extremely meaningful to make sure that nobody's falling through the cracks. In addition to that, one of the things that could be layered on this is the supervisor recommendation with the type of components that were discussed earlier, to make sure that when a person has completed that year of supervision, that the supervisor, similar to what's happening right now with the 1390s, is stepping forward and saying, I believe that this person is ready to be able to practice with a full license. And then the last component is something that, while we do not necessarily believe an exam is the best methodology for ensuring competency and public safety, there is the ability to have some sort of mini exam at the end of this time period, if in fact that's something that this group feels would be beneficial. And as mentioned earlier, in most other trades, the exam component comes after the actual practicum. So if in fact this group felt that a mini exam would make sense, that would be the time we would recommend that it be done, and perhaps really focus on practical skills and things that we feel are essential to protect the public. Next slide. So as I said before, if you'd like to learn more about the LSFN, we have a website that outlines both the fellows program and the other work that we do. We have recordings of our stakeholder briefing that shows in more detail the outcomes from last year's cohort. You'll be able to meet our current fellows. And we just want to take this opportunity to thank you for the ability to present our program and to answer any questions that you have.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation and for sharing your stories with us, and especially Jessica for all the preparation and thought that you put into coming to speak with us here today. It's clear that you have gained a lot through this experience. And we're grateful for your time as well as Ms. Solat. Thank you so much for that presentation. We do have a couple of questions. So it looks like Judge Reeser and Mylin.
Thank you for that presentation. That's fairly enlightening. So my question, Claire, what was the subsidy during this 3L period? What was the?
So the equivalent, the stipend equates out to approximately $30 per hour. And so when our fellows were doing 500 hours last year, and the reason they did more is because, as you all know, the bar exam date was delayed. They received a $15,000 stipend. This year, it's a $12,000 stipend, which we're very proud of because it's the highest stipend in this sector. But we're also very sad because we know that trying to study for the bar exam and wait for the results with $12,000 before taxes is really inadequate.
So my question is, there are a boatload of people in California who have full-time jobs and they go to law school at night and they have families to support. Could they participate in a program like this or some version of a program like this and do it in the evenings, because they don't necessarily, they're not assured of being a member of the bar necessarily. They don't want to quit their full-time job, which their career, so to speak, their prior career, or is this a all-day full-time dive in 100%?
So I guess I'd need you to clarify if you're talking about the existing fellowship or if it was morphed into this pathway to licensure, where in fact that would be the person's full-time job for the year that they are within the program itself.
Well, I guess the question is, could this program be available to somebody who still maintains a career because they're not licensed to practice law yet? They're supporting a family like Jessica, and they need to retain their current job. So could they do this in the evening, just like they've been going to law school for 4 years at night and succeed at this program? And then once they're licensed, they can move into a legal career.
Again, I think it's important to distinguish, if in fact this was morphed to be a pathway to licensure, then the person would now have a job as an attorney at an organization. So they would no longer need the prior job that they were doing while they were in law school to be able to pay the bills. In terms of our fellowship, it would be a challenge to have somebody who had a full-time job, because that person, as you can imagine, would then have the commitment to the legal aid organization, their full-time job, and they would be studying for the bar exam. So I think that that trifecta would be almost impossible. And in fact, when we designed the fellowship initially, the issue of whether fellows would work full-time came up, and the law schools were very adamant that they didn't want it to be a full-time commitment because they wanted to make sure folks had time to study for the bar exam. Again, all that would be off the table if in fact there wasn't a bar exam requirement that folks would be aiming towards in the middle of July.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mylin?
Yeah, hi, thank you for the presentation. And I love LSFN. I have a number of former students who have benefited from the program. So thank you for that as well. I guess I had some of the same questions as Judge Reeser in terms of the full-time, part-time. And then I didn't catch who's funding this. Are you doing your own fundraising that then results in the salaries or the stipends for the fellows, or is it coming from some other source? Sure. And then I have one other quick question.
Let me go to the first piece, which is the funding question. The way that the LSFN Fellowship currently works is we do fundraise from funders in our network to support the cost of the program in terms of the stipends that our fellows are receiving, the overhead payment that the LSO hosts have. All that wouldn't be necessary under a pathway to licensure model, because what are currently the LSFN fellows would in fact become your first year attorneys. So the salary that you plan to pay them would in fact already be part of an operating budget. There might be a little overhead amount that an organization might say was necessary to cover whatever additional reporting requirements they have back for this cohort of folks, but it would be de minimis. I can't imagine it would be more than 5,000 or so per placement.
Okay, so the vision is that the office itself would be paying the fully funded position. Is that right?
The host organization would be paying the position because it would be the equivalent, for example, with Jessica, it would be the equivalent as if she was hired as a first-year attorney. So the host organization already has that in their budget, right? The difference is you would take away the uncertainty of whether that organization would be put in the position of having to wait to hire her until after she becomes licensed, or the possibility that they hire her, she doesn't pass a PAR exam, and then they have to deal with having one of their staff people who says, you know, I need a couple months off because I have to prepare for another bar exam.
Okay. And I guess, again, asking you about the vision, that person would be, despite their being on the pathway to licensure, not yet licensed, would they be able to appear in court then? Is one question. And then related to that is, when you're thinking, do you have an idea, a sense of what the capacity for this is? If, I don't know, you know, if we could blink our eyes and have it immediately implemented, what are the numbers that you think are possible?
So in terms of the original question that you asked, when it comes to, I'm sorry, can you go back to question one? Because I'm morphing into the two issues right now.
I guess you said they would just replace a new hire through this program, but the new hire, presumably, if it were that person were already licensed, would be able to take that position.
Okay. So currently our fellows work using a PTLS. Many of them already have it because they've done clinics. We have a few that register, you know, at the point in time that they have been accepted into our program. And that was part of the beauty of the design. When we first set out to do this, that was one of the big questions we had. And we learned, which was news to us and quite frankly to most of our LSO hosts, was that the PTLS doesn't end at graduation, it ends at the release date. So I think that this program with this cohort would be very adaptable using the same strategy and methodology that the current 1390s are working under, where during the time period that they're under the supervision, you know, let's use a year just for simplicity's sake, they are using some sort of PTLS certification to allow them to be in court. And that after they've completed that year and their supervisor nominates them for licensure and they are accepted as fully licensed attorneys, then there are no other concerns or restrictions at that point. In terms of replication and expansion, we know that, as I said, the demand for this program is really high. The amount of supervision, as Jessica said, is pretty much on par with what she's receiving as a first-year attorney now. So it doesn't mean there's an extra burden to the LSO hosts or the government hosts. But I think that while I can't give you an absolute number, there's a finite pool of folks that would be interested in this program, in part for a lot of the reasons that were already discussed today. You know, if this isn't portable to other states, that means that somebody who knows that they want to have that flexibility is probably going to opt to take a traditional exam. If this is only offered as a pilot to folks that want to go into legal services and government positions, that also creates a smaller pool. A lot of the out-of-state people, by definition, they really want something that's going to give them that portability and flexibility, and that's fine for them. But the reality is that this program is here to serve Californians. And so to me, I don't think you have to focus on portability because that's not the mandate here. The mandate, as far as I'm concerned, is to make sure that access to justice for Californians is expanded and that we have the ability for all the wonderful law school graduates who want to work in this sector to be able to hit the ground running, as Jessica said, on June 1st, without all the other existing barriers that are making it so hard for them to pursue careers in the law.
Thank you. Mylin, were those all your questions?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Judge Rossi?
Thank you, Justice. And thank you, Claire and Jessica, for this. Full disclosure, I was a public interest law fellow when I was in law school, and I spent my career in the public sector. And so I apologize if my questions seem a little targeted because of my background. But my first question is, I noticed on your first slide that it's now limited to ABA accredited schools only. Can you talk a little bit about why you set it up that way?
Absolutely. So we literally created this program in 2 weeks. I read the article that was in the Chronicle about the exam being delayed. And as so many of us who've taken the bar exam experience, anytime something refers back to the bar exam, you have this visceral reaction where your palms start getting sweaty, your breath starts getting more rapid. And so at that point, I just said, we need to do something. And so in order to make it work, I brought together a team of advisors that included folks from law school, some public interest executive directors, some other funders. And to pilot this in that kind of time period, we needed to have some sort of confines around the population of applicants that would make it feasible. And as I said before, we were really trusting the law school preparation process as part of how we were presenting our fellows to their host organizations. I do think that this program could be used for non-ABA students. In particular, as I mentioned before, we have 2 tracks. One is where when you apply, it's in partnership with an organization you've already identified. And one is where we match. And I think for the non-ABA students, I would recommend starting out with that joint application track for them, because then you know that the host organization and the 3L already are comfortable with each other. They're not going to be a bunch of big surprises in terms of skill level. So that would be my recommendation on how you pilot. And after trying that, if it seems like it's feasible to do the joint application process, the solo application process where the matches are curated, that may be something that can be offered as well.
Okay, great, thank you. My next question has to do with the government agency sort of route. It wasn't clear to me whether right now they were just LSOs or whether you were also partnering with government agencies within the state or local.
So the reason that we currently don't partner directly with government agencies is because of the funding issue, because my funding comes from private funders that the money has to go to a 501c3. If that wasn't the case, then the door would be wide open. And in fact, I know that when the PLL committee was meeting, some of the people on that committee who came from government offices said they would be thrilled to be able to have PLLs because they already have such robust training programs. So I think that bringing this into the PD and the DAs and the city attorneys and all those other folks would be just a natural extension of the program. And because, as we said before, the compensation would be coming from that organization directly to this new law grad, you wouldn't have the barriers that our current program has to operate under.
Okay. I'm just wondering if because I know for someone like me who came out of law school and had a hard time finding a public interest job, if there was, the state has a graduate legal assistant model now that they sort of hire into before you pass the bar. And I was just wondering if that was something that had been sort of contemplated as broadening to the LSOs, that you're essentially getting paid, you're doing the work, but you're in that time period where you're waiting.
So that's exactly right. And the number one reason that legal aid and government offices can't hire people in the fall of their 3L year is because everyone's waiting for that bar exam result. And if that wasn't a factor anymore, you would be able to see folks being hired for those jobs at the same time that on-campus interviewing is happening. And in fact, even before that, I have people like Gary Smith, who runs LISNEC, who says that he would be thrilled to be able to give offers to his summer 2L crowd, but that big, hairy monster out there, the bar exam, is the biggest impediment to being able to make those offers. In years past, sometimes it was finances, but as we know right now, the legal aid community, fortunately, is being supported much more robustly. And Jessica is, we're so glad she's here with us today, because quite frankly, she's spending a bunch of her time at work interviewing new attorneys, because her organization wants to hire 2 to 3 more immediately. And again, it really comes down to this: we got to wait for that bar exam result, because otherwise, not only can we not utilize the person as much, but we have to plan for them to take time off to study for yet another bar exam.
Okay. Thanks. And the last question I have, and I apologize to all of my fellow committee members for all the questions, but the last question I had is if there are specific requirements that you all have for those attorneys who are supervising your fellows. And one of the reason I ask is that, one of the concerns has been the quality of supervision that fellows or students would receive post graduation. And so I'm just wondering if you have set up requirements for the folks who are the supervisors.
So it's a great question, and we leave it to the legal service organization to designate the supervisor. It does need to be an attorney because they're completing the evaluations. We don't feel that there's a minimum duration that's required in terms of the supervisor's prior tenure as an attorney. We have a couple immigration LSO hosts where, in fact, the supervisor is not licensed in California, but that makes total sense to me because they're not practicing in California courts. Quite frankly, we are delighted to tell you that supervision has not been an issue on either end. We haven't had fellows frustrated because they're not getting enough supervision and feedback, and we haven't had hosts telling us that it's onerous or taking too much time. And in fact, I have, in addition to, as I said before, that the biggest demand I have are for non-traditional law students, and primarily not just lived experience, but language capacity. We have over a dozen languages spoken by our LSFN fellows, which is incredible when it comes to adding capacity. But in addition to that issue, what we recognize is that our hosts would like more time. That's the biggest complaint they have, is they would like it to last more than 6 months. So to your point of, could we find places to place all these fellows? Absolutely. Not an issue. Would they be, would hosts like to have people for a full year? Absolutely. This is just this natural transition from this little program that we created to help this community of 3Ls that were being delayed in taking the exam into this next step of really creating a pathway to make the public sector much more robust.
Thank you. Thank you both for being here. And those are all my questions right now, Justice.
Thank you very much. And Neil, you're next.
Thanks, Justice Guerrero. It was really interesting to hear your story, Claire, and also to hear your story, Jessica. I feel like my story sort of falls in between. I was able to stay at a hotel near where I was taking the exam, but I can only afford a Motel 6. So, but my question is this: I'm curious to know how many PLLs have been in your program so far.
So our fellows finished law school right in that little tiny window, right, where everything was still being designed. We have, from Jessica's cohort, I think we have about 5 or 6 folks who did not pass the bar exam who then applied to become PLLs. The current cohort is not under the PLL program because they don't qualify both durationally and they haven't gotten their bar exam results yet.
Thank you. Leah?
Hi. Hi, Claire. Nice to see you.
You.
So I wanted to just go back to, I think a couple of questions have hit on this, but just scalability. If we were talking about, say, about 10,000, maybe 9,000 people a year that are sitting for the bar exam, and then we wanted to eliminate the bar exam and move to this model. So one question is, would there be organizational capacity to absorb that many applicants on an annual basis? And then the duration of the practical experience itself. So right now it's a pretty limited program covering the pendency of the bar exam. This committee has not even begun to think about what, as an alternative pathway to licensure, what the duration of that experiential requirement would be. But let's just say it was a year, which I think many would think it would need to be. So we're thinking about a year, and you're thinking about that volume of people. And then the question, under this model, these individuals would need to be paid, I think, during that period by the organizations that are sponsoring them, assuming they're not being expected to have another paying job at the same time. So when you think about all those different components, do you actually think the model is scalable, or is it scalable, as you kind of indicated before, if we're focusing on a particular population, those willing to commit to a legal services career or a government attorney career, only those who intend to practice solely in California? If you could just elaborate a little bit more, understanding all of those different components are at play, I would appreciate that.
Absolutely. So it's always been my mindset, which is you tread lightly, especially with something new. So would I offer this program immediately to every single person who was planning to register for the bar exam? No, I think it would be, for multiple reasons, an error to just throw the doors open and let anybody apply. We personally think that it should be tailored to the public service sector for all the reasons we've discussed, in terms of increasing access to justice, recognizing that these are folks who are making a conscious choice to go into areas of practice where they won't be compensated nearly as well as their peers who decide to go to private practice, and the existing training and supervision that exists within the public sector. That, to me, is one of the biggest differentials. I don't know anybody who's gone into public interest work, whether it's at an LSO or a government office, who doesn't say, yeah, the system already exists for oversight. I think some of the largest private firms do have pretty comprehensive training programs for their new incoming attorneys, but a lot of the smaller shops, quite frankly, don't. And so I think it would be something to wait and see if there's a way to develop a program, perhaps for the modest means community might be the next step after this would be rolled out for the public interest sector. But I think that you want to sort of right size it, pilot it for a couple of years, evaluate, make sure that things like public safety and minimum competency are in fact panning out the way that we anticipate. And then you can start to layer on the other possible communities that might be qualified to pursue a program like this, as opposed to a traditional bar exam. In terms of the capacity, when you talked about compensation, as we mentioned before, the compensation for these folks would be the same compensation that you were providing for your incoming first-year hires. And in fact, it will take less financial strain, or will leave some of the financial strain to the host organizations, because, as I mentioned before, they don't have to worry about their wonderful new hire like Jessica not passing the bar exam. The cost of having somebody like Jessica have to be absent from the office for a month or two when she needs to take the bar exam is a financial burden on the organization. It's a capacity burden. It's a hardship for her clients who she's working with, who have to find out that she won't be available for several months. So eliminating that whole piece serves the public in a way that I think is so beneficial that, to me, this is just a natural next step.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I think we had Dr. Henderson next.
Thank you, Justice. I had my hand up and then took it down and then put it back up. So I feel like I'm jumping in line, but I'll take the opportunity. Kristen asked one of the questions that I asked. So I have a different question, and that has to do with the comparability and the challenge for fellows to complete this program successfully. And then I've got a follow-up depending on your answer.
So you're saying in our current program?
If it were to be used across the board for applicants for licensure generally in the state.
So what I will tell you is that last year's cohort started with 30 fellows. One left the program before it even commenced because he got a full-time job offer. The other one left midway through because he relocated out of state. This year we have had no attrition, and in fact, one of our fellows who is in the military reserves had to delay his return back to his LSO host for a month, and that was not a problem at all. We were able to work with that time period. So completion has not been a problem. Last year, in addition to launching the program, we had extensions that we offered because we knew that these fellows were in this very unstable period of time where they were still waiting for their bar results and the rest of the world was still figuring out how we were going to operate during COVID. So many of our fellows, like Jessica, have actually been in our program for a full year. So we don't see attrition issues. We don't see challenges when the organization is saying, you know, we don't have work for the person to do, or we don't think that this is a good partnership anymore. So I have no doubt that if you hired somebody on June 1st in this program, that person would in fact complete the tenure and in all likelihood probably continue on with their organization after they receive their certification.
So the follow-up question has to do with those people who complete stay in and complete the program now. Is there variability in how difficult it is depending on their assignment?
So you're saying in the placement that they received, are they having,
well,
are some organizations much more challenging than others?
That's the question, right? Is the experience of a fellow in one assignment different in challenge or difficulty than the experience of fellows in other assignments?
So I will tell you that there is a little bit of a range that we do have. In particular this year, I think 2 of our fellows were put into policy positions versus direct client work. We have several organizations that are non-traditional legal aid organizations like Legal Access Alameda, that's part of our program. So there's definitely some range of opportunity. That said, the rigor is identical. They're all asked to do the same time commitment. They all have to complete the same evaluations. They all have the same expectations in terms of participating in the learning sessions. They all are expected to be able to, make sure that the organization is feeling that it's worth their investment of time and energy to be able to have a host, but to have a fellow. So from that standpoint, I don't think the rigor is different for any of our fellows because we have all of these different check-in points and safeguards. So I don't have any fear that somebody completes our program and, there is a question of, did they actually do enough legal work? Did they get the supervision they were needed? Did they have the meaningful continuing educational components?
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. Jackie?
Thank you. Claire and Jessica, thank you so much for coming to share this program. And I'm so impressed that you were able to put it together so quickly and for such a meaningful cause. So thank you for that. Mine is more of a comment and perhaps a cautionary statement. I want to make sure, given that one of Donna's slides said that one of the things we need to consider as we map this out is what can we assume about the equity of preparation out of law schools? And I appreciate that Judge Rossi asked the question about the limit to the ABA law schools. And Claire, your answer suggested that, well, there is an assumption built in that the quality of preparation in an ABA law school is something that could be trusted in a way that maybe you weren't confident about with other law schools. I think we need to be careful, because if we're considering kind of equity across law schools, or have to consider that across law schools, that all of us need to kind of check and challenge ourselves about what kind of biases are we bringing into that conversation. An assumption that a student emerging from an ABA law school is going to be more prepared or better able to perform in a legal services setting than a student emerging from a non-ABA law school, I think we need to test that bias. If it's based on bar exam scores, students from Stanford must be so prepared because they pass at a 96 to 99% rate, and students from another school may not be because they don't pass at that rate, I think is going to undermine what we're trying to do. And so I just want to make sure that as we move forward, anytime we're making assumptions about the status of a school and the students that emerge from that school, that we are challenging ourselves and asking, what is that assumption based on?
I completely agree. And in fact, our highest population of participants are coming from law schools that do not have particularly high pass rates. So I think that if hosts felt comfortable having it open to the entire law school community, we certainly wouldn't have an objection to it. But I think that that is also part of the beauty of the existing program, where because there are two entry tracks, one is this joint application and one is the solo where we match. I think that that does give folks like Jessica, who had the initiative, and she's not tooting her horn nearly as much as she should, but we didn't even know when Jessica applied as a joint applicant that she actually went and found an LSO to partner with, because we had said in our application process that the joint applications would be prioritized for exactly the reasons we described, right? If you already know that you enjoy working with someone and you come together and say, we'd like to participate in your program, that takes one of the challenges away from the entity that's organizing it, which is, well, what if we match you and it's not a good fit? But quite frankly, what we know about the legal service and the government sector is they want non-traditional folks. And we know is there's a much higher percentage of non-traditional folks who are attending the law schools that are not the ones that have the 90% passage rates. So I quite frankly think that, I'd love to see the program open to a larger pool. And that simply has to do with, as long as the host organizations feel comfortable with it, we're absolutely on board.
Thank you, Jackie. Is that all the questions that you had? Okay, thank you. I see you nodding. Donna, you're next.
Yeah, I think I have more in the way of an observation as well. Leah sort of got at some of the points that I was going to be asking about when it comes to scalability. But I was just doing some rough math. And if you were to just look at the first time takers from and I'm using the 2019 February and July bar exams, because that was pre-pandemic, from California, ABA approved, California accredited law schools, California registered law schools, just the California schools, there were just over 3,500 first-time takers. And so if we were creating this pathway in lieu of the bar exam, that could potentially be the universe of people that we'd be looking at, assuming 2019 is representative. I couldn't tell you today if it is or not. And so totally hear what Claire is saying. This wouldn't be open to all 3,500. It would be open to a smaller subset of those. But if you look at just the 100 or so legal services organizations that qualify as IOLTA funded organizations, which is the state bar provides funding to, so I know some data about, there are about, I think the number is something like 1,500 legal aid attorneys in those organizations. And so we would be, I absolutely worry about capacity for them. How many people could they really take on? How many first year attorneys is really the question. How many first year attorneys would they normally be hiring in any given year? And is this proposal more of a sort of 1 year proposal, in that if they hire these first year attorneys through this program for the year one, are they going to get rid of them after year one, or are they keeping them on such that they don't actually have funding for another attorney in subsequent years, maybe for a few years out? So I worry about the scalability if we're talking about sort of legal services organizations, and how much of a program would we need to create to support what could be an incredibly small number of people, and does that make sense? I love the idea of providing some focused attention on people going into public service, going into public interest or government. I think that I think that's a really great idea. I just am questioning sort of if that really can't be scaled, then is that a resource that we've got sort of the ability to vote one path to, if it can't be scaled up more than a couple of hundred attorneys max?
So I will say in response to that, I have LSO hosts that I have to disappoint because they want 5 or 6 fellows, and I tell them I don't have enough for you. So from that standpoint, pardon?
You're paying for them right now.
We're
Currently
paying for them, but we also know anecdotally, I talk to over 100 legal aid organizations every year through our work at the private foundation that I run. And as Jessica mentioned, everybody is hiring. Now, will that be the case 4 or 5 years from now? I don't know. But at this point, we know that legal aid organizations and government offices are all ramping up to hire. We know that there's going to be a population of folks that, even if they want to go into public interest work, aren't going to want to opt for this path. They're going to say, for example, as you mentioned before about portability, they may say, look, if another option is going to come down the way that's going to allow me to take a bar exam that can be moved around in terms of, going back to New York or going to Arizona or working in, DC, they may say thank you, but no thank you to this option. We also know that there are going to be, variety of different folks that for whatever reason are really good test takers. And they say, I'm not that worried about the exam. So my sense is that we're worrying about an issue that I don't know if it really is, in my mind, a barrier that should be so feared that it actually gets in the way of considering this option. One of the things people said to me when I created the LSFN Fellowship is, how can you feel confident that you're going to run this thing and it's going to be successful? And I said, I'm not, but I know it's worth trying. And we went out, we did it year one. It was such a success that not only did we do it for another year, but I've got, as I said before, folks all over the country who want to replicate this. And I could put 25 people in Los Angeles tomorrow if I had, the relationships down there to do the matching and the infrastructure to have a larger program. Same thing in terms of, other major hubs. So I understand it's a concern that there won't be the supervision sites and there won't be the interest from the host organizations. But I would ask you all to just, have a little faith at this point and see if the market will in fact bear this. Because I do think that there is the demand for these practitioners. I think they will stay on. I would love to think in a year we won't have the need for capacity that we have now, but that's just not the reality. We know that the issues that are surrounding us because of the way that COVID has impacted the economy and impacted the lives in particular of brown and Black folks, this is going to be going on for years and years and years in terms of the increased need for folks to work in these sectors.
Thanks, Claire. I appreciate that. I definitely fall into that pool that you talked about of people who are driven by fear and risk. And so that's why we have a committee involved in this who are more bold thinking on issues like that. So thank you for that response.
And Donna, I will say that is good law school training, because we were all taught in law school to be very focused on, precedent, to be very risk averse. And, in certain circumstances, that's very wise thinking. I think for piloting interesting initiatives like this, you got to lean forward a little bit and believe that, the great news is that we now have 2 years of this project to be able to anchor the concept on. Quite frankly, our numbers are higher than some of the states that you guys are talking about as using models. So I would say, rather than focus on, Vermont or Oregon, why don't you look at the LSFN's program and see that working in a finite universe, we have such robust demand. And we know, as I said before, that there are areas all through California that are begging us to replicate, and they just need this kind of incentive, which would launch it forward even further than it is if it actually coupled with a pathway to licensure.
Thank you. Claire, could I ask just a clarification question about one of the slides earlier? You indicated the possibility of having a type of mini exam at the end of the program. I understand that's probably not what your ideal situation would be. And currently the fellows had to take the bar exam. I think you mentioned there were 5 to 6, but I wasn't clear on the numbers. I was wondering if you were able to gather any information as to whether the participants felt that they were better prepared to take the exam at the end of this program, or whether they had to go sort of through the same type of situation where some people have the ability to take bar examination courses, which cost a lot of money and time to sit down. So I was wondering what their experience was at the end.
So we did survey our fellows on this, and Jessica, you're welcome to jump in on the comments about whether, in fact, being in the fellowship was a barrier to preparing for the bar exam. So 60% of our fellows said they thought it actually helped with their preparation because it gave them sort of pacing, gave them motivation, gave them a community to feel that they were part of during this time period. 35% said they thought it was sort of an even experience in terms of the time demand of being a fellow balanced with having a stipend, and all the other components made it, sort of neutral. And 5% said, yeah, it probably would have been better for me if I hadn't been a fellow while I was preparing for the bar exam. Again, if we morph this into a pathway to licensure, that issue comes off the table. You don't have to worry about it impacting preparation.
Yeah, and for me, it was, I always like to keep busy. I'm used to just working. That's always been like my type of work ethic, and I can blame my parents for that.
Or thank them.
I try to every day. But for me, I love the opportunity, and obviously it was incredibly attractive that I could have a job that paid immediately so that I can, save some money for rent and things like that. And I also appreciated that we got time off completely so that we could focus on the exam. Whether that was enough time or not, that might be different for all kinds of fellows. But I appreciated that time off, and I appreciated having the opportunity to work part-time to remind me of why I went to law school and why I'm torturing myself with this studying of the bar exam. And as you all know, part of the bar exam experience is mindset, right? And a lot of BIPOC folk, we go through this imposter syndrome where we question whether we're good enough to be, taking the exam, and whether we're good enough to be a lawyer, et cetera, et cetera. And so I constantly went through that, and others, with my friends and within the cohort did as well. And one of the things that we found comforting as you can find during the bar exam studying time, was that, we worked with clients who thanked us, who appreciated our time, who reminded us why we went to law school in the first place, who reminded me why I wanted to be an attorney and why I wanted to advocate for people who look like me, for Spanish speakers, for people who needed help within our community. So for me, it was it was the most important thing for me to keep going every day when I was trying to study for the bar exam. And granted, whether, I didn't pass, but it still reminds me every day why I keep going and why I'm not going to give up.
And the June 1st, I have an echo for some reason. Is that gone now? Yes. The June 1st reference that came up a few times, I wanted to just comment about. So our fellows technically start on June 1st. And they spend a very limited amount of time with their LSO host that month. Part of that is just to be able to get orientated. Part of it is so that they feel like they're part of our community. We have a learning session during that time period. And then they get the month of July off to prepare for and take the bar exam. That is the hardest month for us because our hosts are so desperate to get their fellows back. And when I think about a world in which that wouldn't need to happen because they would be on a pathway to licensure and the additional capacity that creates to public interest firms, that makes me excited. This is, as we know, we're in unprecedented times right now in terms of the tremendous need for people in the public sector to help increase access to justice. And if we had the ability to have people like Jessica who could start on June 1st and not need to take time off to study for the bar, not have to incur the additional expenses that are involved, continue to do her work, we would all be so much better for it.
Thank you both. Mylin?
Yeah, I have one quick request, which is whether you, Claire and Jessica, would be willing to share the templates that you use for your evaluations that the supervisors fill out.
Sure.
And then at your convenience. And then I guess I have an offer or an insight or an observation, and I don't know whether this is the time because it's not so much something for Jessica and Claire to respond to. But as I'm listening, I realize that this is very similar to the fellowship program that I run at UC Hastings, where students extern for a full year during their 3L year, and then they graduate, take the bar, and return to the same placement site for a year, receive a stipend, and it's paid by the placement site, what you're calling the host organization. And I have a little bit of a longitudinal perspective on this because we've been running this since 2013, I think. And I just, again, to the scalability thing, it's very, very dependent on the legal market. Right now, I also have plenty of host organizations chasing after me and my program, but not so much when the legal market had contracted. So I just want to, I guess, note that I have some more detailed observations that I'd be happy to share. And I guess, yeah, that's it for now. But thank you again, Claire and Jessica, for your helpful information.
And I think that, so in terms of thinking about the duration of the public interest market staying as robust as it is right now, there are a couple factors that I think play into this. One of them is, how much in partnership we are with government funding. And fortunately, LAC has been so successful that, for the foreseeable future, we do think that there will be considerable additional sums of money coming in. In addition to that, what we know is that this population of folks that are being served by public interest firms has never gotten the kind of representation they need. One of our fellows is a fellow with dependency legal services and tells us that her client caseload is 110 clients right now. So we're in a situation where if we could maintain funding and actually get public interest attorneys to have reasonable amounts of work, I don't imagine that we will have a shortage of LSO opportunities when it comes to new hires coming on every single year for quite some time.
Thank you. Susan?
thank you so much to both of you. This has been very helpful. And the one sort of observation or comment that I think is important to recognize here is the distinct nature of we need to separate this from a pathway. It needs to be a pathway to licensure. The program has so much promise when you remove the examination, because one of the things that we saw here was that you started the program in the pandemic year where students had an extended time to study, and where we may have seen a far less dramatic effect of working while studying. The latest Access Lexis data shows a horrible correlation between working and passing the bar examination. And so I think it's really important to make sure when we talk about a great program like this and a great pathway and a great option, that we're very important to recognize there cannot be an exam at the end of it, or a lot of what we're trying to accomplish here we will just move the goalpost. We will not change the result.
I agree. I mean, I took the bar exam. I passed the first time. I would hands down pick Jessica to represent me any day versus myself as a newbie. So I think the exam, from what I understand historically, and by the way, as a bunch of background, we did a mapping of all of the fellowships in the country before we created this. We looked at the history of how bar exams were created. Studying to become an attorney under the supervision of a licensed attorney was in fact the normal process. And the exam component only was introduced later in time. So I think in one sense, we're sort of going back to a modification of the original model. When we mention a mini exam at the end, it was really sort of to quell the fear of people who feel that taking the entirety of any exam component away was too dramatic a step immediately. As we heard about in other professional tracks, there are some examinations that happen after people practice for a considerable amount of time. And Jessica and I've talked a little bit about this, perhaps having some of the performance test requirements be a part of a mini exam would be an appropriate way to just make sure that people have competency. But I, for one, would completely be in favor of this program having no exam requirement, because I think that the supervised year coupled with the learning sessions are a much better way to protect public safety and ensure competency. The other thing I just wanted to mention that I didn't touch on earlier is this question that was raised about what are the outcomes like for our fellows in terms of long-term employment. And I will tell you that we're so excited because we are already getting reports of fellows that have been hired outright now by their LSO hosts. I have other organizations like the one Jessica's at that are asking for more fellows to come that weren't placed with them over the summer, but they're saying we have additional capacity needs. So we have actually become sort of a mini recruiting center for both our hosts and other public service jobs, because word is out on the street how well trained our fellows are, and folks are saying, we'd actually like to work with more people who've gone through the LSFN program when it comes to bringing in their first year hires. So this pathway that we have to employment is something that we're very proud of, and we do think that it's an excellent opportunity to support the public sector with these new attorneys, but also give people like Jessica the surety that there is a job waiting for them. Because I think that, this idea that she has already amassed $300,000 in debt just going to law school, and then has the fear of whether she can get a job without having the relationships that she built through the LSFN fellowship, it would be a much more challenging process for her to go out and look for employment.
I just want to go, sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, please.
I do want to point out, back to Susan's original question, just for the sake of not butchering your last name. There's also the new attorney training that the PLLs such as myself have to do. And I'm assuming the 1390s, the extended PLLs have to do that as well. But that can also be attached as a requirement to, this pathway. And there's always the checkpoint at the end where the supervising attorney has to put their word, their reputation, their license on the risk of, well, not on the risk, but for lack of a better word, has to put it on the line, saying that, yes, I recommend this, person to become an attorney. So there's also that checkpoint at the end that will help ensure that, this person does that 1 year commitment of work, has done the work, has done all of the training, has attended the learning sessions, et cetera, and is ready to become an attorney and is recommended by the supervising attorney as well. So there's also those additional things that need to be checked off, if we were to go to this pathway.
And it was commented earlier, all of those safeguards and provisions as compared to, 25-year-old Claire Solat, who passed a bar exam, being able to hang a shingle to perform any type of law unsupervised, I would go with Jessica any day.
So you're touching upon the training, which is what the question that I had. The learning sessions themselves, are those presented through your group, or are they? I'm sure that there are additional training sessions and requirements that the employers are responsible for, but are the learning sessions themselves primarily something that you're responsible for?
We curate the learning sessions, and they're a combination, and Jessica can talk a little more in detail. The learning sessions currently happen every month for an hour and a half. About, I would say, an hour of that time is this subject matter focus, and then the other half hour we do introductions to individuals all over the place who work in different types of public interest work. So for example, later this afternoon with our learning session, the focus is on next steps, and we're going to be having Supervisor Catherine Stephanie and Andrea Fidenides talk about their journey after law school and the fact that they are doing public interest work, but not in a traditional legal service environment. And so we try to do that hybrid where we're teaching them some law, right? They had a housing one-on-one program, they had a disaster legal aid program, but we're also helping them think about the trajectory of what they want to do in public interest work and see lots of different examples and opportunities.
Thank you. Are there any further questions?
And if anyone here would like to be one of our panelists in a future learning session, we would love to include you, because what we have found is that a lot of people do direct services, and at some point in time they say, I do need a little bit of a break, but I still want to do public interest. And you all are wonderful examples of ways in which people can do that work.
Thank you again. Are there any additional questions from the group? It looks like there are none. You've done an amazing job with the program and did the presentation here today. We really are appreciative of your time and all the effort that you're putting into the program. And I just wanted to wish Jessica all the best. Good luck to you in the future. And I'm sure you'll continue to do an amazing job. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And as I mentioned before, if you want to learn more about the program, visit the website. We have all sorts of details. We're happy to give you access to the evaluation, to the application, any of the materials. I personally would love to be put out of business by all of you. I would love to decide that they want to launch this. And, as I've mentioned to many people, we're happy to give you all of our background materials. We're happy to partner with all of you in terms of looking at ways to expand the program. I've already talked to LAC and other statewide stakeholders about whether they would be willing to come in to help expand capacity. And every answer is always absolutely yes.
I just wanted to say really quick, thank you so much for listening to my story, but my story resonates with so many others of the BIPOC community. And so I hope that I spoke for them in some sort of level and advocated for all of us. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. At this point, I'll turn it back over to Donna to share her slides. We have additional slides that will identify the potential next steps, as she mentioned earlier, and also this will give us an opportunity to identify additional presenters or more information that we need.
Thank you, Justice Guerrero. I apologize that the slide is a little clunky, but I realized that I would have needed like a 3D spreadsheet in order to deal with all of the components that I was trying to build in here. So this is the top row really is looking sort of organizing the components that we talked about at the beginning of today's meeting. It just sort of touching on the same components, but organizing them a little bit differently under some of the key focus areas of ensuring minimum competence, ensuring access, fairness, and equity. You'll see I have two columns of that because it was hard to separate access from fairness and equity in certain instances, and I didn't want to make the sort of the choice on which line that fell on. So I grouped those together. And then public protection, which may or may not really be a matter of determining minimum, if we're determining minimum competence. But I've identified here in this row, again, sort of the different things that we initially think that this group needs to consider in order to make recommendations. And then in the column below, identified some possible ways to get at the answers to those questions. And so, for example, looking at minimum competence, what are the curriculum requirements that would be needed to ensure minimum competence, to ensure that there is that consistency across all school types, law office study program? How could we together figure out what those curriculum requirements should be? I think, our thinking was that's an in-depth review of the programs that have been adopted or are being considered in other states. So taking a sort of another deep dive into Oregon, seeing what they're doing. If you are looking at experiential programs like New Hampshire, or a sort of a mix of those, taking a real deep dive into those programs, deeper than just the 45 or 60-minute presentation that we've had. Also, I think looking at the knowledge, skills, and abilities that had been identified by our CAPA working group, because even though those were identified in the context of a bar exam, they were identified as the knowledge, skills, and abilities that are required of entry-level attorneys in order for entry-level attorneys to possess the minimum competence necessary. So presumably, whether or not you go an exam route or some other route, those are the knowledge, skills, and abilities that we would think that somebody needs to have. And so figuring out, reviewing what those are and figuring out how to ensure that those, people that are being admitted to the practice of law through a non-exam pathway achieve those same knowledge, skills, and abilities. And I think this the last one is sort of obvious, but I think we need to talk to law schools. I think we, as Jackie was suggesting, we need to understand what's happening at all law schools and get an understanding of how the law schools could ensure that the curriculum that they are providing or could provide in the future, if this were the way to go, would meet those KSAs, would give us the confidence that people who graduate from a program that is sort of an entirely curriculum-driven program would have the KSAs, or a program that is a combination of learning in law school and a supervisory program, sort of what could be developed in law school and what could be developed through an experiential program. I think that the law schools are a great source of information for that. I'm not going to read through all of this, but you can see here sort of what we're looking at in order to get the data and get the information that you would need. I would say that I've had, I've started to have conversations with psychometricians on the exam side of things, but we need to think about whether there might be psychometric information, like what we talked about earlier today, one of the questions that was asked, and if we can get, a psychometrician to present to us to provide some information on how you assess minimum competence in through learning objectives, is a question that Jackie had raised. One of the things at the end here that in the last column that I have under public protection, that is, in my mind, that was ensuring the quality of the education and the supervision and the training. And the presentation that we just had, I think, raised some of the issues that I put in the second row here about the questions that we need to think about. And where would those responsibilities lie for ensuring the quality of the curriculum and the quality of the educators? When we hear from programs like Oregon, we hear from New Hampshire, there's a really close relationship between the bar and the law school. And typically those, I think they had, 1, 2, or 3 law schools in the state. And so is that something that the state bar could assume responsibility for? How would that work in a world in which we have 50 law schools, as well as a law office study program that allows admission to the bar without law school? As well, looking at the issue of what would the bar's responsibility be for ensuring the quality of supervisors in an experiential program, in a supervisor-based program like Claire described, because I think our presenters made an really interesting point in my mind about the quality of supervision that may exist, of organized supervision and training that may exist in the legal services world that they are currently using for their postgraduate fellows. But if we were to try and place 3,500 law students across the state in any given year, could we rely on that, basically have the trust in the level of supervisors and just assume the supervision is going to be effective and consistent, or what would the bar have to assume some responsibilities, and what would that look like? What would we need to do to ensure that the supervision is the quality that we would require? So I think, so those are some things to think about. And then I said I wasn't going to go through it all, but here, sure enough, that's exactly what I'm doing. So looking to access, fairness and equity, right? So we're talking about scalability. And, one of the questions is, is there anything to be learned from California's experience with the provisional licensure program? The numbers are really small. And so the answer may be no. We can certainly, run the data and provide you data from the provisionally licensed lawyers. And what we're getting at here is, for accessibility, fairness, and equity, is their ability to find supervisors. And so we did survey. So we've got 2 versions of the provisional licensure program in California. One version is the pathway to licensure, and there was a deadline to apply for that, and that was May 31st. And we had a number of people who began the process, but never completed an application. And so we surveyed them to say, what was the barrier? Was finding a supervisor the problem? And ask some questions about that. And we can certainly go through that data, provide that data, do a demographic analysis of that data as well, to see if there are themes, trends in that data. We also will be surveying probably after the February bar exam. We'll be surveying folks in the original version of the provisional licensure program. And that was a program that was open to all 2020 graduates. It didn't have a deadline to apply. It's not a pathway to licensure. They still have to take a bar exam, but the program terminates June 1st. And so this coming February bar exam is their last opportunity to take a bar exam. So if they were going to be in the program, they would be in it by then. And so we'll probably go ahead and survey those individuals also after the February bar exam to get an understanding of those individuals who did not complete, who indicated, who started an application but didn't complete an application, to find out if part of the concern there, why they didn't, was the inability to find a supervisor, and to figure out what those trends are so we can understand if there are issues, demographic issues that are going to really make this program not equally accessible to all of those who aren't interested. And so that's what sort of we've put here on the screen so far. And I would love to use this last 14 minutes that we have to get your thoughts about what sort of how we should chunk this out, what we should start talking about at the next meeting. Should we find a psychometrician to talk to us about the learning outcomes for minimum competence, and how that can be done in a valid way that gives us confidence in a non-exam alternative. What's the data that we should be looking at on for access and fairness and equity? So I turn it over to all of you to help us sort of plan how we're going to sequence our next set of discussions. And I would say, I think at the very least, our December meeting will also be a subcommittee meeting, so we have time to dig into to continue focusing on these issues. And it may be that we have several subcommittee meetings before we return as a full commission. We'll be figuring that out as we go along. But I wanted you to know that this is not sort of are we doing this in 3 months? This will be coming back in December, and really beginning the discussion of how do we develop a recommendation here. And I don't know why my slide just changed. Okay, Amy, you've got your hand up. Amy,
yes, here's a thought. Has any metrics been analyzed regarding the disciplinary actions that have been taken by the California State Bar with respect to those individuals that have taken a test, have been given licensure from other states, and those that have become attorneys and licensed attorneys by not taking the bar exam? Because I seem to see two central themes over the last 4 months that we've been meeting: competency and public safety, and competency and public safety, as well as access to licensure. Those are the two central themes that I have seen one way or another in some form or fashion over the last 4 months. So I'm just curious if anybody's thought to think about looking at the metrics of disciplinary actions that have been taken by the State Bar over the last 20 years.
Yeah, so we have data, and there's a couple of reports, and we can have sort of the authors of those reports present too on the relationship between bar pass and discipline. Looking at if the bar pass rate impacts discipline, right? So if you scored, barely passed the exam or passed the exam with flying colors, what's the rate at which you've been disciplined, and is there a relationship there? Because we don't, everybody who comes to who wants to be admitted in California needs to take a bar exam. So we don't have data in California about discipline of attorneys who haven't taken a bar exam, because we don't have such attorneys admitted to the bar in California. So I think there are some limitations on that. But in terms of understanding if there's a relationship between discipline and how well you do on the bar exam, if that is necessary for us to consider whether we are comfortable recommending a non-exam approach, then we can certainly pull that data together and have somebody present on that. Neil, you've got your hand up next.
Yeah, so it occurred to me during this meeting that, especially when talking about knowledge, skills, and abilities, that I think, and I could be wrong about this, but I think that because of COVID, Louisiana and the District of Columbia, I think they came up with alternative pathways. And if I remember right, they structured their pathways for the applicants to have to reach certain benchmarks. Like in their first quarter of the year, they have to take X hours of a deposition, or they have to at least attend Y hours of watching an appellate oral argument. I'd be curious to see what those programs look like and how successful they've been. And also that also goes to Lynn's program in Hastings, because I'm sure that practice programs like yours also have certain benchmarks that folks have to meet, and be curious to see what those benchmarks actually are.
Yeah, we can absolutely I get that. Again, one of the challenges that we'll have is we can't see outcomes, but we can follow along their thought process on what they thought was necessary and help that spur our thought process. I recall that the DC pathway was 3 years, and so they will be very early into that, and just getting a sense of numbers and what those milestones are. I think you're right, Neil, would be incredibly important. So we will.
Yeah, I think Louisiana has a 1-year path, if I remember right. But.
So I think hearing more from anybody that's got a program out there, it really seems like a critical piece of information for us to help us shape our thoughts, and that might be something that we would want to prioritize for the December meeting. Judge Reeser, you have your hand up next.
So precisely along those lines, I was listening carefully to the Oregon recommendation to their state bar, and on the experiential pathway, they reached out to, I think it was 2 Canadian provinces that had historically utilized this supervisory law school plus supervisory work path as a means to bar licensure. And I think they said, if I recall, it might have been Ontario and Alberta, but what Donna puts on the right of her matrix here, quality of education, supervision, training, bar responsibilities for ensuring quality of curriculum, it sounded like they already have experience because that's been their protocol for a number of years. I'm not sure accessibility and fairness would be a Canadian issue because of the demographic, though there's a lot of Indigenous folks, perhaps in Alberta, but relating to the public protection part of it, I think as opposed to looking at these neophyte programs, we ought to perhaps leverage some individuals who might have expertise in a long history of this.
Yes, I think that makes sense. And I was trying to remember what they call these programs, and
Right, there was a word they used.
Starts with an A, but I can't quite remember the name. But yes, I agree. There is some real value in understanding sort of what, because they've been in existence for longer. I think we need some greater understanding of the context in which they arise and what their sort of law school experience is, because that may or may not be a good comparison for us. But yeah, I do think this really does continue the theme of let's spend some time really digging into the programs that are out there that can help us provide data on their successes and what they are able to do and how that impacts public protection, and also to spur our thinking on programs that we can that we might want to create. Mylin, your hand is up next.
Hi, thanks. My point goes to the second and third bullet point in that minimum competence column. The KSAs that CAPA developed, and this relates to what Jackie said in her very first comment, how did those map onto California Law School's PLOs, right? Program learning outcomes, because we all have them. And theoretically, we're all assessing our students' competence within those PLOs, which I think are not so dissimilar from the Kappa KSAs. So for me, it would be interesting to hear back from the psychometricians, but more teed up and related to that. Are there assessment mechanisms already being used? Are they valid? And how could we either build on those that are already occurring at the law school level or replicate them at the post-grad level to better assess the efficacy of any experiential non-exam pathway?
Yeah, and I think we would certainly need some more information on how those program learning outcomes were developed. Certainly the Kappa recommendations came from surveys of California attorneys to determine what knowledge, skills, and abilities are required of entry-level attorneys, and that's sort of the angle of that. And so understanding the angle that the law schools use to develop the program learning outcomes, and then and if they are, as you surmise, if there's some real consistency there, then that might really provide us a good something to build on for determining that a curriculum program in a law school would in fact meet those minimum competence requirements.
Can I just ask quickly what that is, the program learning objectives? I wasn't sure what you were referring to.
So the ABA requires that the law school have identified program learning outcomes, which are theoretically very similar to Kappa in the sense that every graduate should be able to, for example, conduct legal research and et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, thank you.
So they're on an institutional level, theoretically all grads or some, yeah, theoretically all grads should be able to meet.
Susan, back to you.
This is a very nice segue because that overlaps a great deal with exactly what I wanted to add. And I think one of the things we need is a psychometrician to help us not only see that mapping, that overlay between the outcomes that we know we want and the outcomes that law schools are required to have, but I think it's important that we recognize a couple of things that might not be, to those of us that work in law schools, this is old news, but law school education has changed demonstrably since all of us went to law school, that many of us are attorneys. We went to law school in the days pre-assessment, pre-learning outcomes. There has been a radical overhaul of how law schools plan and map curriculums and how they plan and map learning outcomes. It's not limited to ABA schools either. I share Jackie's concern that we don't think that narrowly, and that we also should recognize there are things like WASC, there are Western and regional accreditators that also have all kinds of learning outcomes. And it's not just enough to say all of our graduates will be able to do X, Y, and Z by the time they graduate. I think it's important for us to recognize that our accreditors, whether they are regional, whether they are the ABA, whether they are all kinds of things, require that we actually show we're doing it, that we have to have a demonstrated ability that this assessment is not only taking place, but that we're meeting those requirements. So I think it might give us a great piece of this public protection component if we could look closely and have a psychometrician help us look more closely at how the Kappa recommendations overlap with what law schools are required to do and prove that they're accomplishing. Because I think a lot of work has been done here and a lot has changed, and that it's not something the public's aware of, and it's not something that folks that work outside of law schools are necessarily very aware of. But a psychometrician could really help us here.
So Susan, how much of the project program learning outcomes are dictated by the ABA, and how much are developed by each individual school?
They're not dictated by the ABA.
Is there a model that you can compare, or do 50 schools have 50 different approaches?
It's a very interesting development, the way it started. The ABA did not dictate them. And in fact, law schools were required to create their own. Many of them created their own by using faculty committees, by using inputs from all stakeholders, alumni, students, faculty, staff. And at the end of that day, what you will see, however, if you do even just a quick assessment of a few law schools, you can generally find these things, by the way, on a law school's webpage. This is public information and easily obtainable. They're very similar. So a lot of law schools have a lot of very similar ones at the highest level, because when you are going to assess something at an institutional level, this is something that schools often have something between 5 and 12 big picture assessment kinds of outcomes. But they also have to meet all of their accreditors' more narrow restrictions and requirements as well. So there's often a combination of sort of dictated lower level requirements from a regional accreditor or the ABA, but the big picture learning assessments, there's overlap between what schools do, but that's because of the nature of, I suppose, all law schools agree on a lot of the very core things that a lawyer should be able to do. It's not uncommon to see legal research, legal analysis, school skills and advocacy.
Great. Justice Guerrero, we've hit 12:30. We've got 2 more hands up. Are you okay with us taking the comments from the final two individuals?
Yes.
Dr. Henderson, since we've been talking a lot about psychometricians, you've got your hand up. So let us know what we've been saying wrong.
Note that I'm not volunteering, however, but I do. So I'm building off again on what Madeline brought up, focusing on obviously the content framework for alternative assessments that are being used as alternative pathways to licensure. Beyond the content specifications, which I think your outline here really covers pretty well, I think that we need to factor in, get information from a psychometrician or an expert in program evaluation around the comparability of the challenge or and rigor across the program for every person who comes through, and how that's documented, how it's assessed, and then also the reliability of the decisions that are made about licensure and their comparability with the decisions that are made from an examination route. I'll pull back in the interest of time, but I think a focus on not just what programs are doing and how supervision is happening in them, but on the outcomes and the comparability of how they've measured the proficiency of the attorneys who finish these programs, and the relationship between that level of proficiency and the level expected that's required to pass the test. I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Leah Wilson, you have our final comment before I turn it back to Justice Guerrero.
I was just wondering if the group would find it helpful to learn a little bit more about medical licensure. Specifically, I was thinking about the residency programs and how this question of consistency and oversight is handled in the medical setting. And then also my understanding is the exams or the boards that are required for licensure take place, most of them during medical school itself. And so that is a different form of an alternative pathways rather than having an exam after law school is completed, incorporating exams along the way. So just wondering if the group would find that helpful.
Thoughts, comments, thumbs up, thumbs down?
I think it is a really good idea to look at other professions. Medicine does offer a good example because medical school is divided into two big sections. The first part where they learn the sciences and all of that, and then they have a test, and then they move into a clinical education phase. And and then at the conclusion of the 4-year medical school, they face the medical licensure test. I think there's a lot of good parallel that can be found there. Also with engineering. Engineers complete their engineering education. They, if they want to become professional engineers, they then take a test that assesses their content knowledge. Then they work for 3 years under the supervision of a licensed attorney, and then take a test for licensure that's focused based on the kind of engineering that they are interested in being licensed to do, which gets to part of the conversation earlier today, where a license is specific to a general area of practice. For engineering, like structural engineering, civil engineering, electrical engineering, and so on. Those licenses are specific. So I think parallels in medicine and engineering could be really interesting.
Great, thank you. Judge Reeser, did you want to respond?
Yes, I don't want to exacerbate the time, but I agree wholeheartedly with Leah's recommendation. I did have a very long, as part of my outreach, I did have a lengthy Zoom with Dean Jennifer Martinez of Stanford, because I wanted to understand, from her perspective, who I would think, just because of bar results and so on, would be least likely to modify the status quo. I have many pages of notes of my discussions with her, but the one thing that resonated with me out of that discussion is that Dean Martinez said the trend in education is away from omnibus examinations, which dovetails with the sort of medical analogy, and also in terms of messaging. Instead of calling it experiential or a experiential pathway, we could always call it residency, and that might gain some traction as well. So I think that's a great idea.
Great, thank you. Justice Guerrero, turn the mic back over to you.
Okay, thank you guys so much. I think at this point, we should just conclude with the thought that the December meeting will be a continuation of this type of format where we're going to meet as a subcommittee and then reconvene at some future point to be determined as a commission. The commission as a whole will do that. But so I wanted to thank everybody for your time today and ask if there's any other business. Okay, hearing none, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you all.
Thank you.
See you all on December the 8th.
Thank you.